Hey everybody, this is Blake, and today I'm going to be talking about evidence comparison. Evidence comparison sounds like a really broad term, and technically speaking, everything we do in debate is pretty much evidence comparison when we're talking about things like, which card has the best warrants or justification or things of that nature. But evidence comparison, the term, is most often used to refer to a really specific thing, and that is deciding which piece of evidence is more credible based on incidental details like author qualification, when it was published, and things of that nature. So evidence comparison is a pretty specific skill, but it's also a pretty useful skill that can be applied in a lot of situations. So what are some of these specific situations in which evidence comparison is probably a very smart move or an essential move? So when cards are being directly compared from a warranting perspective, if they are in direct opposition. So for instance, if a turn clashes directly with a link, so we have a piece of evidence that says, international aid is good for the environment, and another piece of evidence that says international aid is bad for the environment, and those warrants are in direct opposition to each other, we're going to want to look to some other things to see which piece of evidence is maybe more credible, so that way we can decide which of those statements is true. Or when you're doing impact weighing, so for instance, if you're trying to decide what's more important between economic collapse and international tension, maybe a good way to go about that would be to look at the pieces of evidence that are defending each of those impacts and which author or study or piece of research that analysis is based on is more credible. And then another time when we might want to use this is when a uniqueness disagrees with another piece of evidence. So for instance, if a dissat has a card in it that says, we're right on the brink of an economic collapse, and then the opponent gets up and reads a piece of evidence that says, actually, the economy is more stable than it's ever been, then you're going to want to be able to compare the credibility of those claims to find out which one is coming from a more believable author or research. So another time we want to use this evidence comparison skill is whenever we're specifically focusing on author qualifications or study methodology in an essential part of an off-case position or an advocacy. So even though this wouldn't necessarily be comparison, it's still a really good time to use these same tools and skills. Like when we're defending a disad link or something like of that nature that is very much specified to a microscopic change. So for instance, if on an environmental link, the link is like a 2-degree increase in global temperatures, we're going to want to make sure that that author is very qualified because they're talking about something very specific. So when you're extending that piece of evidence, it's probably a good idea to say, this is a highly qualified author because X, Y, Z. Or when you're extending solvency for a counterplan or an alt or a policy app or something of that nature, you should probably talk about what lends credibility to the claim that this solvency scenario is true and why that specific policy option you're advocating for is effective. So these are just a couple of the times that you use evidence comparison, just the first ones that came to my mind when I was putting this video together, but there are infinitely many other scenarios in which you can use evidence comparison. Like I said, it's a great tool that you'll probably use pretty often, so don't think this is an exhaustive list whatsoever. So structurally, whenever we are making evidence comparison claims, it's very, very similar to weighing. If you watched our video on weighing, you're going to see just how similar this bulleted list is. So first we're going to name an area of focus, kind of explain if we're looking at author credibility or maybe the study methodology or something of that nature. And then we're going to explain why our evidence is strong in that sense, why we do a good job under that area of focus. And then we're going to explain why our opponent's evidence is not so good in that area of focus. And then we're just going to kind of take a step back for this step 4, talk about the big picture and why this evidence being more credible is so important for this round. So because steps 2 through 4 are very, very similar to the steps 2 through 4 for weighing, I'm not going to go into extensive detail about the tips and stuff for how to be more persuasive when you're explaining why your evidence meets an area of focus. If you want that kind of analysis, we give that in the weighing video. I would strongly suggest you check that out. But this video, we're going to be really talking about these areas of focus in step 1 and what type of things matter when we're talking evidence credibility. And then we'll have some examples at the end where you'll see kind of what these steps 2 through 4 look like when we're applying those tips that I talk about in other videos to this specific area. So what are the areas of focus for evidence comparison? Again, these are just some of the really big ones. These are by no means exhaustive, but author qualifications, like are we dealing with some grad student and their thesis paper was published on the internet and we grabbed it from there? Or are we dealing with a professor who is, in a position where they do a lot of research and have kind of boiled all this research down to one paper? Or are we talking about a researcher that's actually doing original studies and conducting these research activities more directly? What is the nature of the publishing? Is it from a blog? Is it from a peer-reviewed journal? Or is it from a news site? Is it a recent publication, or is it really old? Is it from a journal that is now defunct? Or is it from somewhere that maybe has some type of bias that we should take into consideration? There's also the style of analysis. Basically, is this an empirical piece of evidence, or is it hypothetical? Is it talking about things we should do, or just describing the status quo? And then there's also study methodology, which is asking details about things like sample size, statistical analysis, like what percentages are involved and things of that nature, and the procedure of the study. So when we're talking about author qualifications, there are a couple of more specific questions that we can ask. And so for all of these slides where I get into specifics about the area of focus, these questions that I'm listing are the questions you should ask yourself in prep time when you're trying to come up with this evidence comparison argument, kind of looking through your opponent's site or drawing on research you might have done prior to the round because, for instance, an author is really common on this topic, something like that. Basically, these are the questions you should be asking and taking into consideration when you're doing this evidence comparison. And if one of these answers seems a little lackluster, it should kind of set off an alarm in your head that that's a good place to focus your evidence comparison. So for author qualifications, some of the specific questions: what is their career? So that's kind of what I was getting at with this idea of what is their level in the kind of academic hierarchy? Are they a professor, a researcher, or a student? Something like that. More often than I think a lot of debaters realize, the online studies that are published are sometimes from students or peer-reviewed journals that focus on undergraduate research or something like that. So it is kind of important to take note of that and include kind of an explanation of what your author qualifications are in the site, so that way you can kind of head off this type of debate and do that research ahead of time so you know if this author that you thought was super awesome and credible is actually just somebody that is taking, a Stats 101 class and had to put together this paper for a final, and the professor published it. Another question: what is the area of specialty? So, for instance, if we have this really, really incredible economics researcher that is super well respected, but then we use this economic professor's writings on global conflict and war, talking about loss of life as opposed to the economic impact, maybe that economic researcher is all of a sudden not as credible because they're outside of their field of interest, their field of specialty, so those qualifications seem less impressive. So are they writing within their area of specialty? How long have they been in the field? So again, if we're drawing these lines between student and professor and things of that nature, we also need to take into consideration that people can be professors for different amounts of time. So a first-year professor or a first-year researcher is not going to be persuasive as a 60-year-old researcher with 40 years experience in the field. And then what are their affiliations? This is one that I think a lot of people don't consider. Sometimes researchers can wind up working for partisan organizations or for third parties. So for instance, if there is an article that is written about how fossil fuels really aren't that bad for the environment, and then you look up the research organization and one of their main sponsors is connected to OPEC or some other petroleum-related company, then you should probably be thinking maybe this is not a credible piece of evidence, maybe this is actually coming from a biased perspective. So the next area of focus we're going to talk about is the nature of the publishing. So there's a lot of specific questions here because publishing is a multifaceted area of focus. But so, for instance, how academically credible is the source? Like I said before, is it a blog or is it something that is a respected journal released from an Ivy League or something like that? So a lot of times when we're giving you all advice on how to research and find pieces of evidence, we'll tell you to avoid just Googling stuff to find evidence, but rather look to things like JSTOR or Google Scholar or something like that, because that kind of automatically filters out blogs and things that are less credible. But you still need to keep an eye out for that, and your opponents, you need to keep an eye out to see what type of sources they are using. And then, is there a political bias in the organization? So, for instance, if we're pulling from news sites, a piece of evidence written by Fox News versus a piece of evidence written by MSNBC are probably going to report about things a little differently based on their political affiliation. If we're pulling an article from Breitbart, they're probably going to be taking a more right view than if we were to pull from a left organization. So we need to take into consideration that political bias and kind of see if we're thinking of this from the perspective of what are the political effects of this article. Sometimes that research can take on a different light, and we can realize that maybe this is less accurate scientifically, but more a recruitment method tool. And then another question, is it peer-reviewed? I've tossed around that term a couple of times. Peer-reviewed, when referring to academic journals, means that they were run through multiple people in that field, in that same area of study, that have verified the results of that study or verified the analysis as sound in that paper. It doesn't necessarily mean that those people agreed with them, but rather that they agree that there's not any glaring academic flaws in the writing. So tools like JSTOR or other online journal databases pride themselves on including a lot of peer-reviewed journals, meaning that they don't really put forward studies that are not academically sound. So peer-reviewed journals is kind of meaning that that study gets an extra stamp of approval from other people in the field saying that the research method is solid. And then, is the publishing site an opinion-based site or research-based? So this is kind of the difference between like a news article versus a journal. So sometimes we'll find news articles and we'll think, oh, hey, this is pretty good because news is supposed to be more objective. But in reality, if you look at 99% of these news articles that we're cutting from, they're going to say opinion up at the top because we are dealing with topics that are predictive and prescriptive. So the writings that are on them have to be opinionated and coming from a certain field. So we need to be careful that we're not pulling from opinion sites as much as we are pulling from data-based, fact-driven research sources. And then, does the organization have any motives that affect the topic area? So this was kind of like what I was talking about when researching like author ties and connections. Is the organization, for instance, owned by a company that would profit from the resolution passing or something of that nature? Keep in mind that there are a lot of times kind of interconnected webs of sponsorships that could lead to some organizational bias that can be a neat way to kind of criticize your opponent and call them out. And then a really important question that is a pretty obvious one is, when was it published? If we're talking about, for instance, that uniqueness example I gave before about one piece of evidence saying the economy is on the brink and one saying the economy is stronger than ever, if the one saying the economy is on the brink is from a month ago and the one saying the economy is really strong is from 2 years ago, we're probably going to believe the one that's more recent because we're talking about something that changes from day to day with the economic strength argument. So recency is also really important when it comes to evidence comparison. So then there's also style of analysis. This one's a little bit rarer, but it is still something to consider. It's a perfectly strong way to criticize an opponent, but it's not something that I hear quite as much in debate. Is the author over-relying on anecdotal evidence, or are they using empirical evidence? A lot of times in debate, we prefer empirics, or like studies and statistics, because they are more reliable, and using anecdotes, like for instance, telling one really emotionally charged story about injustice relating to a certain topic area might be more persuasive, but it might not be representative of what the norm is, and empirical evidence helps us kind of detach and look at it from a more logical perspective. And then, is the analysis descriptive or prescriptive? Descriptive meaning it's just describing the status quo, saying, hey, this is what the norm is, this is what society looks like now, whereas prescriptive is saying we should do this is what I would suggest we do as an expert. And depending on the context, if it's like a solvency or like a link evidence or uniqueness evidence, you're going to prefer descriptive or prescriptive based on whatever the specific use of the evidence is. And then is there heavy use of hypotheticals? And this kind of ties into this last point, is there a lot of qualifiers in that analysis? Do they seem to be relying more on this kind of imagined world balance and norms that are not necessarily in place now to describe how certain events will transpire? And then is the language absolute or full of qualifiers? How confident does the researcher or author seem in that analysis that they're talking about? And then study methodology. This is a really great tool that people don't use to its fullest extent. A lot of people will ask about methodology and push people on methodology, but they don't quite get into the details that I think make methodology a really persuasive area of focus for evidence comparison. So for instance, what was the sample size? How many entities were involved in the research? What are the detailed statistical results? What percentage were success and what percentage were failed? How was the data gathered? Was it kind of based on just like research, or was it based on experimentation? And then was it meta-analysis or original research? Meta-analysis meaning that they looked at a bunch of studies that already exist and took the results from a bunch of individual studies, combined them, and then ran another round of statistical analysis on those combined results? Or is it original research, meaning that it's not based on anything, but this researcher, this author just came up with this hypothesis and tested it themselves? How are key terms defined? So for instance, when I was talking about the detailed statistical results, what is a success and what is a fail? What are the key terms? So for instance, some topic that happened recently, it was the 2019 Nationals topic, I believe, was about revolutions, and revolutions can be large scale or small scale, so a lot of those studies defined revolution differently. So how are key terms defined can affect how wide of an umbrella that research covers. And then what time frame was studied? Are they studying recent events, or is this a study based on 1800s statistics and like a retrospective study? So I ran through the details on this slide a little bit quickly because if we get into statistics and study methodology, that's its own video, and there are plenty of videos out there on YouTube right now that'll give you a breakdown of why all of these things are important. And I would strongly suggest that you take the time to watch a couple of maybe like introduction to statistical analysis videos, things of that nature, to kind of explain these key concepts and why they're so important from a result analysis perspective. So for instance, we know from our high school science that we're supposed to have a big sample size, and we know that a 40-60 split is less important or less significant than a 90-10 split, but we don't quite know how to quantify that significance. So if we develop a basic understanding of statistics and concepts like p-value and significance scores, we can be able to articulate these in a much more smooth and persuasive way in debate. So I would strongly suggest that you familiarize yourself with those things. And the goal with our understanding of statistical analysis in debate is that you want to reach a point where you can use those terms and explain them so that way the judge can have an understanding of what you're talking about as well. So for instance, you can say things like, my study has a p-value of 0.02, which means that there is a 98% chance that this result was caused by the change in the x variable, meaning that there's only a 2% chance that these results are meaningless. And if you're able to do that level of analysis, it's very impressive to the judge, and it is a boon to your speaker points and things of that nature if you can do that level of complex statistical analysis and make it accessible to the judge. So while you can get away with doing this methodology argumentation without having that level of statistical understanding, I would strongly suggest doing some research in there. It's a great way to help your speaker points and increase your persuasiveness when doing this type of evidence comparison. So now we're going to give a couple of examples. So if you remember, the structure for these claims are to name an area of focus, explain why your evidence meets that area of focus well, explain why your opponent doesn't, and then provide a larger implication for debate. So here we're going to name our area of focus, prefer our evidence based on author qualifications. Our card was written by a Harvard professor of environmental science with multiple fellowships and academic honors based on his work in the field. So that's me explaining why my author is so qualified. My opponent's card comes from a grad student's thesis, meaning their author is a few decades of experience short of being able to compare to the quality of our analysis. So that's a criticism of my opponent's author qualifications. And then to give some larger implications, this means that if you're trying to evaluate the environment advantage, you will be siding with our evidence every time, meaning that we are on the brink of environmental collapse and need immediate action like the AF. So if you'll notice in this step 4, I kind of gave them the implication that evidence comparison means that you're always going to be preferring our evidence, and then I gave that some context. If you believe our evidence, what does that mean for the round? So if you believe that this Harvard professor is more credible than this grad student, then that means we are on the brink of environmental collapse based on what that evidence would say. So with this example, we're getting pretty specific with our area of focus. We're talking about author qualifications only. But with evidence comparison, we can be a little bit more general and combine areas of focus to produce an example more like this, where we say prefer evidence based on methodology and journal credibility. So we're kind of combining a couple of areas of focus. Our evidence is based on a meta-analysis of 137 revolutions conducted over the last 50 years. Of the revolutions that included foreign aid to revolutionaries, 78% resulted in successful overthrow of regimes. This study is published in a peer-reviewed journal released by Oxford. So a lot of this is just kind of regurgitating details from this piece of evidence, but the important thing to note here is that I'm using very direct language, and I'm kind of listing these qualifications in a way that kind of adds up to make the judge think, wow, that's a lot of things in favor of this evidence. Whereas with my opponents, I'm going to be pretty direct about it and pretty critical in my language. So I'm going to say my opponent's card is an anecdotal account of 3 specific revolutions where aid was ineffective, and it is published as an opinion on the blog section of the New York Times. So when I'm describing my own evidence, I'm being very specific in the use of numbers and statistics. I'm using a lot of buzzwords like meta-analysis and successful overthrow, peer-reviewed journal, things of that nature. Whereas with my opponents, I'm pretty blunt and direct about how critical I am of this piece of evidence. I'm saying it's anecdotal. I'm saying that it's overly specific. I'm saying that it is an opinion from a blog, really kind of undercutting it from all different directions. So then when I take a step back, I say this means if you're trying to decide how effective aid is in revolutions, you should probably look to the more thorough and academically verified study as opposed to my opponent's questionably valid opinion piece. So these are just a couple of examples. They are good kind of representations of some of the different things we can do with evidence comparison. So use these as kind of a starting point when you're trying to come up with your own for when you're developing this skill and maybe first doing some drills. So I'm going to wrap up this video with some tips about how to do evidence comparison and defend yourself against these types of arguments and kind of preempt this type of discussion. So the best piece of advice I can give you as far as defending against these is always write thorough cites, because that does 2 things. One, it means that you're going to be doing more research into that evidence that you're doing. So for instance, you're going to, when you're writing a thorough cite, you're going to want to look up the author, list their qualifications, find out who published that, and do a little bit of research into them as well. What the specific data publishing was, follow all of these specific rules about how to write super thorough cites. So you're going to be doing that research, so that kind of stuff is going to be in the back of your mind. But then also, if you are including that stuff in your cite, so if after your author name you put their qualifications in parentheses, then in cross-ex, in later speeches, they're easily accessible to you, and you can grab them right away and talk about how qualified they are without having to kind of take prep time to think back. You have it right in front of you in the document. So include author qualifications and methodology information in your own cites. And then also be sure to read your opponent's cites when evidence comparison is likely. So if they read a turn that clashes pretty directly with one of your pieces of evidence, skim through that cite to see. You never know what you're going to find. You might find that it is from a blog. You might find that the author doesn't have any qualifications, or you could find anything that could be good leverage for evidence comparison debates. And then also use CX to press your opponent's knowledge of the evidence. So for instance, if they don't have author qualifications listed, you can be pretty direct about that. In CX, be like, what makes this author qualified to read this? What is some background on this author? If it's a research study and it's giving you some statistics, be like, how were these statistics gathered? What is the methodology of the study? And if they're not able to answer those questions, be sure to point it out when you're doing the criticism of them in part 3 of evidence comparison. Say, we're not even sure where these statistics came from, so it's hard for us to say how accurate the methodology of those studies were. And then this one is kind of an interesting one. Search for your author name and other evidence. A lot of times in debate, since we're dealing with topics that are pretty specific, we're going to be dealing with authors that are aware of other authors in the field. So in academia, if you are known as an author that specializes in the study of foreign aid and revolutions, you're going to know about the other professors that talk about that, and you're going to write articles that review other pieces of literature written by those other experts. So every once in a while, one card that is read in around might reference another card that it directly contradicts. So you can use Control F or Command F, depending on what type of computer you have, to search through those documents and see, just double check if your author's name is in there. Sometimes it is in a critical way, and sometimes it is in a supportive way, and you'd be surprised how sometimes that can give you some shortcuts on how to do this evidence comparison. And then also, these last two hints kind of get at the point, the last two tips get at the idea that evidence comparison is an extremely small scale part of argumentation. We're talking about two very specific pieces of evidence. So what we really need to make sure that we're doing, even though evidence comparison is a good tool, is find out if it's worth the time to apply it. Because these arguments take, 15 to 20 seconds to make thoroughly. And if this is a piece of evidence that is not going to win you the round, then maybe you should just cut ties and concede it. But this second to last tip is really making sure that you know that it's worth the time to kind of consider what happens if I concede this evidence. Is it damning for me? Will that give my opponent a chance to win the round? Or if I concede this evidence, does it just turn into defense and I can extend something else and save some time elsewhere on the flow? And then if you do need to make a evidence comparison argument because it is a piece of offense that is in question or a card that you really think you need to go for to win the round, be concise in making that argument. Try to make it as short as possible while still meeting all of the criteria laid out in this video. So that's all I have for this video. I hope it helped, and thanks for watching.